everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking with positive psychology and performance coach, Jon Yeager. Jon, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
It's great to be here, Dan.
Really excited to have you on. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself to get us started?
Well, basically, I grew up a little bit west of Boston and played sports probably after the age of 10 or 11, found out that I really, really enjoyed it, and eventually played college, high school and college lacrosse, and eventually after that played in the major indoor lacrosse league until my body gave out. But at the same time, I was always fascinated with the why of behavior of athletes and coaches. And so I looked towards my graduate studies in that area, and eventually, after becoming a coach of different teams, actually started coaching coaches in those areas. And it's been really, really exciting.
Now, talking about coaching coaches, you've written a book called The Coaching Zone, and that's what we're here to talk about today. We're going to be talking about this book. I've really enjoyed the past week looking through it, taking some notes and drawing on some techniques that you've written about, and enjoying your pearls of wisdom. So really excited to talk about this for the next hour. Tell me a little bit about where this book has come from, Jon.
Well, in many ways, my co-author, Jon Cunha, and I have had a little bit age difference, but had some similar athletic experiences. And it really comes from our own experiences as athletes and also as coaches, but also observers of coaches. And for me, it really, the epiphany came when I was 11 years old. And I like to run. I like to run distances. And so I talked to my father, and I got enrolled in a July 4th road race, which would come before the holiday parade in the town that I was living in. And I was really excited about it. It was a 3-mile race, and I had really never run that far before, but I got to the starting line and I saw everybody around me, and I was the youngest person there by like 6 or 7 years. And most of the people were in their 20s and 30s. And I could feel this pang of anxiety. My heart rate sped up. My hands went cold and clammy, and I didn't know what to do. And so I looked over at my father, and I consider him my first coach because of what he did next. He smiled at me, and that smile said everything. It said, "You want to do this or you don't want to do it? Your call. What do you want to do?" So with the anxiety, with the stress, I got to the starting blocks, the starting line. The gun went off, and we took off, and I finished dead last. The parade almost caught up to me. But one of the things that I learned out of that was this notion of what I talk about in the book is called psychological capital. It's basically having hope and having a pathway to get there, having confidence, and having that support from my father with that confidence, being resilient, and then having a level of optimism that went in there. And I've been able to do that, I believe, as a coach afterwards, and to really observe that in effective coaches out there. The second story happened when I was a senior in college. This was in 1975. I was a senior eligibility-wise. I'm not sure if I was a senior academically, but and so if you picture me with brown hair down to my shoulders, parted in the middle with a headband with the peace sign, that was me, and that was our team. We were Boston State, and it's now actually Boston State's UMass Boston, and we were playing our first game of the season against Bowdoin College from up in Maine. We were playing at our home field. Now, in the Boston area, our campus was over in the Fenway area, over where the Red Sox play. But our field was 3 miles away on the other side of Harvard, on the Brighton side of Harvard University. So we played on a town field that had a lot of dirt, some glass, and a couple rocks. And then we were separated by a chain link fence in the beautiful, pristine fields of Harvard. And so we would drive over there every day. And I was really excited from a performance standpoint with our team, and hoping that things would go well that day in our first game. And We got over, and I played absolutely awful. And now, as a goalie, and some people in lacrosse think goalies are courageous, other people think they're stupid. But anyways, I played awful, and I wish the coach could have even taken me out of the game. But unfortunately, my backup goalies weren't ready for prime time, so I had to live in that world. And I know you probably counsel many athletes who have to live in that world
Certainly
and
do.
have to suffer
Yes.
with that. So
Yeah.
for the next several days, I grieved my identity being somehow taken away from me or lost. But there was redemption in 2 days because we were playing our next game at our home field in Alston Brighton against Middlebury College from Vermont. And what was really excited for that, and we got to our field and we got out, and as we got out of our cars and we went to our warm-ups, one of our players, Ronnie and Jimmy, had shaved half his beard off before the game to kind of pump us up. I'm not sure what that meant, but anyways, and at the same time, the coach from the other team, Rob Pfeiffer, was barking out instructions to Middlebury, and they seemed very, very organized. We were fairly organized, but maybe not as much. So, really excited. Got into the game, first shot of the game, and they score. Ball goes through my legs. Okay, it was a good shot. And then the second shot goes over my right shoulder. And then suddenly, in the back of my mind, my monkey mind, or the drunken monkey in the back of my head, started saying, Jon, you don't have it. You just, you're an imposter out there. So why don't you just give it up?
Yeah.
And so I kind of worked through that a little bit, took some deep breaths. And fortunately, one of the Middlebury players actually came down on me through a breakaway and got through all our defensemen. He took a shot, and I guessed with my stick, and I caught it. And the crowd of 10 went nuts. They went ballistic. I passed the ball out. We got the ball down to the other end of the field, and we scored. And then we scored the next goal. And then we just kept on scoring, and the ball became like a beach ball for me. I was in the proverbial zone, and we win the game 6-2. But that's not really why I tell you this story. What really was most important happened in the second period when the coach of the other team, Rob Pfeiffer, called a timeout. And so he yelled out, Middlebury, timeout. The official blew his whistle, and our players ran dutifully over to our bench and the Middlebury players to theirs. If you remember Ronnie, who I just spoke about, he runs over to their bench, goes through their huddle, which you don't do. They don't know how to react. He jumps on the back of the coach of the other team. And we're saying, Ronnie, what are you doing? What's going on out there? Well, the coach turns around. Ronnie comes off his back, takes off his helmet, half a beard. They look up at each other. They smile, and they both begin to cry and hug each other. And I'm saying, what's really going on here? What's happening on this lacrosse field right now? Well, the backstory. When Ronnie heard the voice of Pfeiffer yelling the timeout, the last time he heard that voice was 6 years before in the jungles of Vietnam, because Pfeiffer was Ronnie's platoon commander. And he remembered the inflection of the voice, and they hadn't seen each other since they came back from their deployment.
Wow.
Longest timeout of all time. But it also said to me is the relationship, not just in playing against another team in competition, is that philosophically, you need the other team to make this work. And the bottom line is I am still friends with several players in Middlebury who became educators and coaches afterwards because of that moment. And that's probably one of the greatest sports moments I've ever had in my life. And it happened actually, in the huddle off the field, and affected so many people at that time. In fact, I followed up and became a good friend with the coach of the other team, Rob Pfeiffer, based on that moment of what happened there. So those are two long-winded events that really helped to shape the direction I eventually went with the book. I've gone with the book. It's taken 45 years of coaching to actually put this together, of taking the experiences that I've had and to really meld things in there with some of the research, and also with a lot of different stories and interviews of over 50 coaches and sports psychologists that I worked with through the book.
I love that, Jon, for so many reasons that I probably I'm not articulate enough to put into words at this moment. But what I love about it, especially the one thing that um, is thrown out to me here, is this notion of, when you're a coach, you're a sports psychologist or a sports scientist. So much of what we do is driven by our early experiences in sport. For you, your experience at a very young age, I think it was 11 years old, you said, and running in that race, and then a college experience, which just one can't top that story at all. But those early experiences really do shape the path one goes down in sport and the attitudes that one takes. And it's fascinating that those kind of, without putting it too scientifically or clinically, those psychosocial moments, if you like, drove you to become, the psychological practitioner that you've been, the coach that you've been, and now culminating in this book. And it's a 320 page tome of and treasure chest of ideas and philosophies and techniques. And you mentioned there in your first story that psych capital, the psychological capital, and I started to read that and I was like, wow, I've never really heard of this concept before. So I've probably got a lot of sports psychologists shouting at me right now as they're listening and going, how can you not have heard of that? But I hadn't really. So, there was so much in the book that was new to me, and as well as stuff that was reinforced in a very articulate way. So really excited to break down this book with you. And just, your stories there really bring to life the genesis of the content. So thanks so much for that. And what also grabbed my attention, Jon, was, I love the way this book is in 3 sections. And it's in 3 sections for a reason, because you've borrowed from Daniel Goleman. I think most people tuning in will have heard of Daniel Goleman. He's the psychologist who didn't coin emotional intelligence, but popularized the term. And the 3 sections are in line with Daniel Goleman's assertion that a truly focused leader has 3 lenses of concentration: the self, others, and the wider world. And that's how you structured this book. Can you sort of expand on that a little bit for me before we dive into that first section?
Certainly. Well, Dan, when I first read Goleman's Focused Leader, which is in the Harvard Business Review in 2013, I was really struck by that. And I was actually teaching a leadership education course at the Culver Academies, where I was doing some of my teaching at the time, and found that it really resonated with the students, resonated with other teachers. And then I began to look and say, this type of leadership is something that really coaches and effective coaches actually do without even realizing that they're doing it. They have that tri-level focus. And the important thing is it's probably impossible to focus on all 3 at the same time, but it's their ability to shift in and out of those different areas at the right time for the right reason with the right athlete, with the right team that makes this work. And I saw that, especially starting it off with this notion of coach self-management, of really looking at coaches, how they are become self-aware and how they self-regulate as being a precursor to how they work with individual athletes and also with their teams, that to really get a better understanding of why am I doing what I'm doing? What are my motives behind what I'm doing? And in some ways, kind of how are my stories coming to life, and what I say to myself, and what stories are important to me from my own athletic days as a younger coach or an athlete, and then how do I convey those stories to the athletes and teams that I work with? That's being so important.
You've mentioned self-awareness. As you've alluded to, 3 sections, 3 principles. That self-awareness piece is in the first principle. we're going to dive straight in there. I think it I suppose made me chuckle a bit, Jon, because when I opened the book and realised that was the first section, it was like, yep, that's pretty much what I'm sort of saying a lot of the time, is that, we starts with me, and that, they start with you. And I think
Hmm.
we underestimate that, don't
That's
we?
right. Yeah.
So it was, you got some sort of knowing nods from me straight away, at least from my perspective, anyway. And you urge your audience, your reader, to consider strengths, consider your strengths, and actually you direct them to us the VIA, which is an online platform related to positive psychology, that helps people discover their strengths. And that must be something that you're urging a lot of coaches to do, because as coaches, we can be we can fall down that rabbit hole of thinking about what we're not good at all the time. I'm not saying that's not
Exactly.
relevant, but that must be such a big part of your job, Jon.
Certainly, certainly. And, one of the things when I have coaches take the strengths inventory, I also ask them too, is that, talk to some of your fellow coaches or maybe some of your athletes and ask them what they think your strengths are. Give them the list of the 24 different VIA strengths, and you get kind of some observer data there to say, this is how I see myself. Well, how do other people see me? And is there a disconnect there, or is there a connect? And I think about this, and this is from another book I co-authored called Smart Strengths, but looking at strengths from a standpoint of SMART, meaning that strength spotting, that's the S, that, how do you spot your strengths in your thoughts, actions, your behavior out there? Okay, how do you manage your strengths? What are the strengths that work for you in there, and how do you manage them? How do you articulate them when you're communicating them to other people? How do they work in relationships with the R? And the T is training. How do you train others? In many cases, your athletes and or assistant coaches to learn a little bit better with this. So I really emphasize the notion of strengths, but also mention that, that it's important for us to understand and look at our shortcomings. And we all have blind spots out there, and sometimes our blind spots show up in the most interesting types of situations. But in many ways, getting coaches to have a leniency for the past or a generous understanding of their shortcomings, understanding that some things they can make shifts in, and other things that's going to be really hard to do. It may be really hard to tell a coach who's very, very passionate and emotional in his or her coaching to tell them to just take a deep breath and calm down. No, they may not. That may not be part of that. It may, and not to say that it's necessarily a shortcoming at all, unless it gets them into trouble, you know. But to understand is that, that this is a really important thing, is to see the back and forth between strengths and shortcomings.
It's interesting you've mentioned passion there, and sometimes this word passion is used within coaching, and used synonymously with great coaching. Great coaches are passionate. However, as you've sort of alluded to there, that actually passion it can help us, but it can also hinder us, like every personality characteristic. And one thing that you did in that chapter that really caught my attention was drawing the difference between harmonious passion and obsessive passion. Jon, I loved that, because I'd never really considered that, essentially.
Certainly, Robert Valorin at the University of Quebec at Montreal kind of coined the phrases harmonious and obsessive compassion. It really mixes in well with coaches, because a coach who has harmonious passion tends to blend their sport in nicely with other aspects of their life. Coaching's important, but it's just one part of their life. But coaches who are obsessively passionate may spend so much time coaching that other parts of their lives suffer. Okay, they offer experience their passion as an internal pressure that controls their actions.
It's so interesting, Jon, because as you're speaking there about coaching being one part of a coach's life, it makes me think of coaching well-being. It makes me think of the importance of not just athletes enjoying multiple identities. That I spoke with psychologist Rebecca Symes on the Sports Psych show about. Coaches require multiple identities, and often coaching is their hobby, an important hobby to them. But for those who are doing it full time, coach well-being is so important, and coach well-being starts with self skills, doesn't it? It starts with having and recognizing that enjoying multiple identities as a coach is important.
Yes, it definitely is. Is to understand that this is just one piece, and it's just as we've talked to athletes about, trying not to, specialize too early in a sport. We say that to to coaches in many ways, is saying, what are all the aspects of the life that bring you joy, satisfaction, fulfillment, and that how does coaching fit into that rubric that you have right there? Because we've found some coaches that just who focus so much on the game, it just begins to take a while, that they don't seem fulfilled because they're always chasing the brass ring out there.
In this opening section, you introduce your audience to this notion of PsyCAP. And I know we're probably going to expand upon PsyCAP as we go through into the second principle and the third. But why don't we start talking a little bit about it here, as it applies perhaps to the coach. But tell me a bit about PsyCAP, because it's something that I'd not really heard before, psychological capital.
Fred Luthans and his colleagues from the University of Oklahoma, I believe at Lincoln, really came up with this term, working with corporations in business back in the mid to early 2000s, and basically from that was able to find that by having these four elements or traits of PsyCAP together, kind of collectively allowed persons to be, they were more positive, more focused. And then if an organization did this collectively, okay, they would have this sense of collective PsyCAP where they would be more on their games individually and collectively. And so when he came up with, and his colleagues came up with these four different areas of looking at the notion of hope from a standpoint of setting goals and how can coaches set goals. Secondly, having pathways to achieve those goals, because if one pathway breaks down, what's another pathway that you can take? So you're willing, not wishing, for change to happen. And the third piece, Dan, is having agency, having the capacity to say, to go after this goal. And so in many ways, asking coaches to continually look at, what are your goals? What are your goals for coaching? What are your goals with the team for the season? You may do a team exercise that looks on goal setting, but what is it that you have that goes into that helps you frame what you want to get out of that as a coach there? Which leads into the work in efficacy or confidence. And one of the things that Luthans and his colleagues have termed is the acronym HERO, HERO. H is for hope, E is for efficacy or confidence, R is for resilience, and O is for optimism. And so it's a catchy acronym there. But efficacy or confidence, he does, and I tend to look at the work that Albert Bandura has done on confidence, and looking in that, for coaches to look at some of their mastery experiences that they've had in as athletes and or as coaches, and kind of take some of those aspects and bring those towards learning a new skill or acting in a different way. At the same time, looking at getting feedback from other people, okay, and recognition of what you're doing, and that's really important. The third piece in there is really looking at how the person psychophysiologically, how the coach prepares themselves for matches and or games, and then the the other component in there is being able to vicariously live through other people, of looking at what are my coaching role models, or do I take a kind of a hybrid of different coaches that are out there? And in some ways, coaches can take a look at some of their own coaching when they've been at their best in the past and model off that as they move into future events too. And so that's where we see the confidence come in. The third is the notion of resilience, and resilience is talked about, of course, all the time in sports psychology. But looking at the capacity to work through a challenge and also not just bounce back, but bounce forward, and to do that. And I use a lot of work with almost like kind of a cognitive behavioral approach of looking at belief systems and looking at what coaches' belief systems are about, who they are, and how do you reject negative belief systems and replace them with realistic systems that come from that. And the fourth is the level of optimism. And I take some of the work that Sandra Schneider's done at Florida International in the area of realistic optimism. And she talks about the notion of having to be optimistic as a coach or an athlete or as collectively as a team, is to really have a sense of leniency for the past, is not to be as critical of what's happened in the past before. Actually trying to change your memories of that. Now that can be really challenging for any human being to do, but also then to have an appreciation of the present. And then from that, looking at what are the opportunities here for the future. And Lutherans would say, if people are taking all four of these and kind of working on all cylinders with all four of those, you're going to move the needle. But it's also one of the things that I speak about in the book, okay, is to chat about, what if one area is not as strong? So how can you pick up on that and address that as a coach? Which in many ways, if you're more focused on the HERO acronym, then you're able to communicate better and be able to search and see this in some of your athletes and collectively in some of the teams that you work with over the years.
I love this, Jon, because as I was listening to you, I was thinking what a great framework or model to drive your environment. One that still starts with you, but drives at what could be construed as a healthy and a safe environment. If I adhere to this notion of hero, if I, have hope by setting out clear goals or objectives and working out a pathway there. If I think about working on my efficacy, my confidence, and the little sources, the Bandurian sources of efficacy, and I know you go into that in granular detail in the book, so that's great. And then the resilience, those realistic beliefs, as you say, real feeling of managing the emotional temperature of the team, the club, the organization, when you can start using language that's more realistic and help instill beliefs that are more realistic, which goes hand in hand with the optimism, and Schneider's work on realistic optimism, not being so entrenched in the past and maybe the failures of the past that can drive that unrealistic language and negative language. So as you were speaking there, I recognize that hero, as we're talking about it, it's directed towards the coach. But once, you as a coach, you're embracing that, you have a better chance to have a healthier and safer environment for your players.
Exactly. Yeah, it allows for the coach to begin to see where he or she is, okay, with the HERO acronym, and then be able to work with the athletes.
Now, talking about working with the athletes, moving into the second part, the second principle, others, you start off by saying, by suggesting that this starts by cultivating connections. Connection seems to be really important in your work.
Yes, it is. I mean, cultivating connections through building trust and showing athletes that they matter. is critically in there. So there's not necessarily a nanosecond of doubt that the athletes might have because of the relationship that they have with the coach. And so I think one of the things that comes up here is and it's talked about a lot in sports psych circles, is the coach's capacity to have empathy for his or her athletes. And I look at taking it one step further and looking at Goleman's focus leader, and what he talks about is in leading and empowering others is the empathy triad. And the empathy triad is made up of three components here. And one is cognitive empathy, where in this case, the coach understands the perspective of the athlete, is able to understand where they are at this time. This is something that's really showed up a lot with coaches that I've spoken with in the past year with COVID, where for coaches, they have if depending on whether they're on contract or not, they have another year to coach, when things are cleared up. But for some athletes, especially seniors in their last year, have missed out on those experiences. And their final experiences with their teams have happened through Zoom, and so coaches, to really understand the perspectives of their athletes, to have an emotional empathy of really feeling what the athletes are feeling. Now, this goes to what is another term called the hot-cold empathy gap, which basically there's sometimes can be a gap between how the coach sees the perspective and actually feels, because they're not where the athlete is. They may have been there in the past, been there, done that. But the thing is that they need to be aware of that. So the coaching self-awareness, to be aware of the hot-cold empathy gap, meaning, that some of these issues may be really hot for the athletes in situations, and they're cold issues, not any big deal for the coach. And that's a coach's capacity to see that and be aware of that. The third part of the empathy triad, which is just as important, is empathic concern. It's basically saying, I am here for you. And basically coaches, as my father did at that road race when I was 11 years old, even by just looking at the athlete, showing up and being there and saying, I am here for you, no matter what, unconditionally, speaks volumes in helping to cultivate connections with athletes.
Jon, do you think it's possible as a coach to hit within that triad 1 and 3 and not 2 and still be effective? By that I mean to be able to see the perspective of the athlete in front of you, to express empathy, empathic concern, but not necessarily emotionally resonate with you.
I think that there's certain degrees where I believe that's possible. Some coaches use all three. I believe that cognitive empathy is essential, as well as empathic concern. And in his book, Paul Bloom, in his book Against Empathy, which is an interesting title, it really gets somebody to say, well, what's that about?
Yeah.
Talks about a term called rational compassion.
Mm.
And this means that sometimes coaches go to the emotions so fast that they don't step back a second and say, okay, let's be really clear on this, especially if an athlete has committed a transgression. So where a coach can say, where the athlete comes emotionally to the coach, and even though there's a consequence to the transgression, the coach can show cognitive empathy with that person without emotionally getting involved with that. Okay. And then still show rational compassion for the athlete there, and an empathic concern. Even though you're going to miss the next several games, I'm here for you. This is okay. This is going to work out, but there's still going to be a consequence there. And I think that's really, really important, because if a coach got caught up in the emotions of the athletes so much, it'd drive them crazy.
Yeah, it's interesting because talking with Stephen Rolnick about this, Stephen's been on the Sports Psych show. He's the founding father of motivational interviewing, and my understanding, and it's just my understanding, is when they look at empathy from their perspective, it's a listening statement. It might be that they don't necessarily agree with the
Mhm.
behavior of the individual in front of them, but empathy is a statement that reflects back the behavior without judgment. And that strikes me as the sort of the cognitive empathy that you might be
Sure.
talking about here.
Yes, certainly, certainly. And that brings us into this notion of mattering. Catherine DiLorenzo, who's the women's field hockey coach at Middlebury College, once said, I interviewed her, and her quotes were gems. She says, "When you feel known, you feel relevant. And when you feel relevant, you're motivated to contribute." And that's part of cultivating the connections so the athlete is known not only to the coach, but also is known to the other members of the team.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more, and it demonstrates you care. And talking about caring, you move on from empathy and talk about, the importance of connecting with an athlete's purpose. And as I was reading that, I was thinking about it, and I was thinking that so often it seems like a really simple thing, and it also seems like a critical essential. But I wonder if it's so often overlooked because we're so fixed on, I suppose, as coaches, what we're trying to achieve and our game plans and our training sessions, that we sometimes forget that the athletes and an athlete in front of us has a purpose. They have their greater purposes, they have their objectives, and sometimes we forget about that, within the relationships that we're trying to strike with our players.
Right. And listening, in many ways, listening to the stories of our athletes really allows for that to come out. But first, as a coach, understanding their own stories. And I use the four-letter acronym, another acronym here called SARI, being what's what's the situation that their story comes in? What's the action?
Mm.
Okay. What are the results? And what are the insights, that we see there? I once worked with an athlete who had I had coached him in lacrosse at a high school, and eventually I kind of demoted myself when we brought a new coach in, and the team got really good, by the way, when that new coach came in. But anyways, I became an assistant coach, and this athlete, he was actually a senior. He was a co-captain of the lacrosse team, but also of the football team. 228 pounds, 5% body fat, 6'3", and so he was a man child. Uh, but he really didn't care for the head coach, and ended up actually getting thrown off the team because he was just sabotaging the situation. And I heard about that, and I was really concerned and upset. Too much is given, much is expected. In some ways, it's just body by Fisher, brain by Mattel. What was going on right here? So he had emailed me that night after he was removed from the team and said, "Coach Yeager, can I meet with you tomorrow?" And I think he wanted to use me as a get out of jail free card and talk to the head coach to get him back on the team. And I figured, I'm not going to do that, but I'll meet with you. So I met with him the next day, and I could have said, right away, "What were you thinking?" And got really upset with him because he walked into the office. Can you imagine my office walking in with this big kid and with these puppy dog look on his eyes, and just saying, what I said. I made the shift, and I asked him about his strengths. I said, "Glenn, what are your top two strengths that you took in the VIA that we did in our health issues class?" And he said, "Well, leadership and humor and playfulness." I go, "Well, how does that come alive in the things that you do? When does it work for you?" And he told me a couple wonderful stories, about how they came alive. And then I said to him, saying, "Okay, they tend to work for you, leadership and humor and playfulness, but you're in my office right now and you're not on the team. So what's going on? What's really going on?" And I just stared at him, and I thought he would give some thought to this, and he just stared right back at me. So after 40 seconds, I put my head down and saying, "Okay, how am I going to work this?" And I turned back up and I looked back up, and a tear came down his eyes, and then began to sob uncontrollably. And eventually, when he stopped crying, he said, leadership and playfulness gets me what I want, but it always doesn't get me what I need. And he realized that especially his negative leadership and his sarcastic humor and other things really took him out of the game. When he ended up going back to the coach that night, called him up, and coach let him back on the team because he was so authentic with that. Now he ended up couldn't be a captain anymore, but was a great player on the team for the rest of the season. Ended up playing college football, and is now a captain in the U.S. Marine Corps. Flying jets somewhere around the world. Somewhere in the world right now. But that conversation I had with him only lasted 20 to 25 minutes. But for me, it was the notion of cultivating connection, but also leading him and empowering him to make the call. And I think one of the big things about coaching is to be able to balance what we call a polarity or a healthy tension of providing direction at the same time empowering athletes. And some coaches, they provide so much direction, they micromanage. And some athletes are so empowered, that they don't listen to the coach anymore. So it's kind of getting together and getting kind of hitting the sweet spot of that. And I talk about that healthy tension of polarity and a variety of other ones in the book, because I think effective coaches really are able to hit the sweet spot in these areas.
I was about to throw back at you as you were regaling us with that story, the power of values. And I was going to say that from the perspective of it's great to help somebody set some values, because then you can utilize them to start to help them brainstorm the positives of those values. But interestingly, in your story, it was helping that young person, or that young person figured out at that time that humor and leadership, two values, great, but there can be not a dark side, but those values can help us and they can hinder us. We're coming back to that again.
Certainly.
And they were helping him at times, and they were hindering him at other times. So again, as you were speaking, I was thinking this, coming back to the self-awareness piece, not the self-awareness of the coach, but the self-awareness of the player, that what you were doing there was helping that player focus on his values. And it seemed to me that it drove his awareness of himself.
Certainly. Yeah, it was transformative, not for him, but it was also transformative for me, and to see how changing that approach to cultivating the connection, instead of making it just a strict transaction, with the athlete, it's more transformational.
Absolutely. And as you were saying there, those polarities, for a significant part of that section moving forward, you talk about the challenge of challenging players as a coach, and yet being able to manage conflict. You talk about autonomy supportive coaching versus controlled coaching. When to be autonomy supportive, and when to be maybe a bit more in charge, and maybe a bit more transactional. That my understanding of the research literature suggests that transformational coaching is optimal, but that doesn't mean we're never transactional. It's understanding
Exactly.
when. And then you move on in that chapter to start talking about psychological skills. Again, I suppose coming back to what you might call the PsyCap. But there's some great detail on what I would call mental skills, psychological skills in that section. That seems to be, again, something that because it's so, you talk quite broadly about mental skills in the book, it's obviously something that you've considered important in your career as a coach.
Certainly. And that was one of the things that my co-author, Jon Cunha, and I kind of deliberated about, is that we had put an awful lot in there about how coaching athletes to assess their own skill development, and this notion of mindfulness and being present to win. We could have actually written another book on it, and we decided to give it to give it some importance, emphasis, but not to go totally into it, because I know we'd go down a rabbit hole because there's so much to
Mm.
it. And that's, but we looked at the notion of being able to, of trying to be present. And the term being present to win is typically in the States there. If you go to a, kind of a church bazaar, or there's a raffle happening at a county fair, they said, well, you can buy your ticket to win the prize, but you have to be present to actually win it. And actually looks to the work that Jon Kabat-Zinn has done on mindfulness, and brings to light that coaches, and Jon talks a lot about this in the book, of addressing stuck thoughts, that are in the mind, and learning how to reject those sticky thoughts that are right there, and eventually begin to accept changes, um, in those, going through almost like a continuum of being able to be. I know Chris Germer talks about this in his book, of mindful compassion. I don't have the exact title of it, but he talks about the acceptance continuum. About being able to, tolerate, this uncomfortability, and being able to, if you can't be confident necessarily right there, well, maybe you can at least be courageous, and work towards trying to focus and localize those special moments out there.
In those first two sections, you go into rich detail about coach self-management and leading and empowering athletes. The third principle, the third section, is entitled The Team Dance. I mean, Jon, tell me a little bit about the team dance. What is this section telling us?
It's really about looking at understanding the rhythm, and coaches that needed to understand the rhythm and flows of their teams as they, it could be, at any time during the season, beginning, middle, end. It could be from season to season as the enrollment and the membership of the teams change, typically from year to year. And it's also about having coaches being able to, uh, hit the sweet spot with the polarity or healthy tension of the individual and the team. Now, some people will say there's no I in team. We know there is an I in team, and that it's important for individuals to get better at their skills, and for coaches to acknowledge that. But we also know it's very important to, identify, team identity and the power that it has for an individual to be part of something, and, you know, uh, excuse the cliche of being something greater than themselves. Mark Duran, in his book, there is an I in team, speaks about this in sports and in business. Um, and and so that's a really important point where the coaches can begin to really to hit the sweet spot with that, of knowing when they need to do that, and then bringing out the best in, self and others, with that. So the team really is a system. And looking at what's called the systems dance, Barry Oshry has done a lot of work in his book, The Secrets or the Mysteries of Organizational Life. He talks about, in any type of organization, there's tops, there's middles, there's bottoms. And it's not to necessarily that you're one or the other. It's, in many ways, you play all those different roles. So you can be your coach where you're kind of a top to the team there, where you have responsibilities, and then your captains or seniors may be your middles, and your bottoms may be the rest of the team. But in sometimes your team leaders, okay, your captains may be the tops, okay, where a coach may be a bottom to his or her athletic director, okay, whatever like that. But it's really interesting to see, if you're looking at this within a team, If things aren't going well with the team, there's a tendency for the bottoms, for the most of the team, to band together and to have this own collective identity so they can live in some of the suffering that they're going on within the team. And then they can blame it up. Okay. And they blame it up. They can do that through the captains or all the way up to the coach. Okay. That's disempowering. It's important for the coach, though, to empower the bottoms and to empower them by, and I don't want coaches to go out there after listening to this and call their players bottoms, because they won't understand that. Okay. The players won't understand that. But the thing is that what coaches can actually do is to empower the athletes by saying, you are part of it. You're right there. You're in the game. You're doing all this stuff. What can we do to empower you even more so we can make the right decisions at the right time for our team? So it gives them their own individual voice as well as a different type of collective voice. And so sometimes coaches disempower themselves by feeling like, oh, I've got so much responsibility for this whole team here. And sometimes what they do is they take in all this responsibility as opposed to saying, wait a second, I need to generate responsibilities with my middles, my captains, and with the remainder of the team, where captains may feel caught in the middle and feel paralyzed there, that say, well, I need to take care of, the bottoms, and then I need to take care of the coach too, rest of the players. And then they get caught up by taking sides and stuff like that. And that's where I think it's critical that coaches really work with their captains to really look at what is their, I don't want to call it job description, but what are the responsibilities of the captain? What are they capable of? What's their capacities? Instead of just having this as an honorary degree to go out there and to be a team leader. I'm giving it a very short description of that, but I think it's really important for coaches to see the tri-level relationship that they see within their teams.
Well, let's just dwell on that for sort of the last 5 minutes or so, because I think it's a very pertinent area of coaching within a larger organization, if you like. Especially, let's say, at the adult elite level. I mean, here in, let's say, English soccer, you've talked about a blame culture. I know a lot of head coaches, and we're talking about very few coaches on the planet here who coach at that level, get to that level. But, a lot of them lose their job because they've lost the dressing room, is the term, right? That manager, as we'd say here in England, that manager lost the dressing room. And that's often, you've kind of articulated there, what can tend to happen is if we were to split it up into three, top, middle, and bottom, it's the bottom players who could be, let's say, the disenfranchised players, the disenchanted players, are the ones who are driving the whispers, driving the blame culture, driving the wedge between different groups and different factions. And so subsequently the head coach loses their job. And I've had quite a few coaches say to me, what kind of things can I do? And you mentioned one thing, which is actually to address it with some of the players and sort of ask them, well, how can you be involved more? I mean, whether it's from your experience or from what you've written in the book, what little ideas might you have? How would you go about a disenfranchised bottom rung of your team?
Well, I'd like to see the team get an opportunity to declare themselves
Okay.
individually and collectively. And that's done by really looking at, were there any established core values for the season of what the team wanted? And if there was, is to revisit that. But if they're not, is to actually go over that and to actually begin to look at and saying, what's important for you folks? What's important for you? Why are you out here? What's important for you? And the coach says what's important for him or her, and then be able to work through that in such a way so they hear. And this can be done in small groups and then put it on easel paper and put it up right on the wall. And then they can share that with other groups so everybody hears it. And you would look at, what are the behavioral anchors to live in those values? What are the things that we can all agree upon that are important to do? And my hope by doing that, that helps to empower the athletes a little bit more. This is best done, you know, earlier in preseason, but all even though those can be done, but if the behaviors are not matching up, the ideal and the reality are not matching up, then I think it's important to go back to. The same thing too is having coaches being able to clarify this and articulate this with parents in youth sports too, of saying, these are the core values of the team, and how does that look what does that look like for parents there too, so that they're following, the core values also.
It's interesting as you're talking there, it made me reflect on a conversation I had on a sports psych show some time ago now, but with a sports psychologist, Dr. Andrea First, who worked with the GB women's hockey team who won gold at the Rio Olympics. And, again, I understand I'm talking about the elite level here with resources, but she talked about how they spent around about 12 hours working on values at the beginning of the 4-year Olympic cycle. They did the heavy lifting first. That gives you a better chance potentially to ensure that there aren't going to be those disenfranchised players. I think the other thing I'd like to get your comment on what I'm about to say, Jon, I think also some of the solutions lie in some of the things we've said, or a collection of the things that we've talked about already, which is to collaborate with players to improve your closeness with them, to mind the individual and help them be aware of their purposes, which you've mentioned there, to set those values, to understand that to empathize with individual differences, as well as try to explore similarities. And conversation. I think you mentioned the word conversation in small groups. I think that sometimes we're a bit scared especially in elite sports, because we love getting out on the training field and playing and practicing. We're a bit scared of conversation and over talking, if you like. But if you can have those ongoing conversations that helps players to participate, to be involved, if you're autonomy supportive as a coach, if players have the opportunity to express some vulnerability as we go through the season, and they're presented with those psychological solutions that you've talked about in the book, then we give ourselves a better chance to retain the interest, focus, confidence of that bottom rung of players, if you like.
Exactly. It's continual action, and continual. I believe coaches who are lifelong learners need to continually look and to see what they can do differently to make sure things work. And this has been seen, coaches that have been very, very experienced over 20 and 30 years who've been able to make the shifts in their behavior and how they approach athletes. That at first were closer to their generation, and now they may be 1 and 2 standard deviations of generations apart there. And it's continually going back there to look at the psychological capital, their own psychological capital and their athlete's psychological capital, to try to bring out the best in them.
My last question for you, and it's a question I've kind of just thought of as you were speaking there, because you mentioned this term generation. Are you optimistic for the future of coaching when one thinks about autonomy supportive versus controlled coaching, when one thinks about authoritative versus authoritarian coaching, that we don't want to be authoritarian, but we want to be authoritative, but the history of coaching on both sides of the Atlantic has tended to lean towards authoritarian. Are you optimistic that we can become better coaches of people in the future?
I'm optimistic with one caveat, is that coaches need to be lifelong learners where they continue to look at different ways to appeal to their athletes. That there are times, that to be, candor and diplomacy, confidence and humility is to be able to know what resonates within them as coaches, and then also bringing it to the table with athletes by getting to know and understand what helps to motivate and move the athlete. Um, and one of the things I talk about the book is that coach biases. I mean, who are the athletes that you love to coach? Who are the athletes that you don't care to coach as much? And why is that? And how can you work to bring out the best in those athletes? How can you see their, in some ways, their personality style, and to bring that out a little bit more? So I think it's possible as long as coaches continue to do the work. And this is basically kind of, reflective thinking over time that they've tried, trying different things to work with different athletes so you can get different outcomes.
Fascinating. Well, Jon, I could talk to you about this all day long and listen to the wonderful experiences that you've had in the world of coaching. But I'm mindful of your time. I'm really excited that this book is out, and I know it's just been released, and I know that there's going to be so many listeners who will want to purchase a copy and dive into the book. I mean, it's 318 pages, I think it is, of so many techniques and hints and tips and advice and from two lifetimes of coaching. So how can people get hold of this book, Jon? And how can people follow you and get hold of you if they've got any questions for you?
Certainly, Dan. You can get the book through Amazon. The paperback is up right now. The Kindle should be up within next week sometime. We have an official launch date of April 8th. So on April 8th, the Kindle will be for $199. That's our specific launch date deal that we have there for the Kindle version. But the paperback version is available now. And then if you do purchase a paperback version, there's a bonus gift in there that you hit a link that will get information, your name and your email over to us. And what we'll do is we'll send you a 65-page coaching zone playbook, which actually takes all the exercises that are in the book, but it puts them in a kind of larger font, and it's something that you can download and you can reproduce and copy into hard copy, as opposed to kind of turning in the binder and the spine and putting it on the photocopy machine. You actually have permission to take that and use that with your fellow coaches and your athletes. You can reach us through our website, which is thecoachingzonebook.com, thecoachingzonebook.com. Okay. And also I can be reached at Jon@Yeager Leadership, which is one word.com, Jon@YeagerLeadership.com. We have a webinar coming up in the States on April 8th, but I think I might, with the time difference, it might be a little bit late. It's at 7:30 Eastern Daylight Time, which is probably around 11:30 or 12, UK
12:30.
time, 12:30 UK time.
Yeah. Well, we've got some ambitious
Yeah.
coaches, Jon.
We don't want it to be obsessive coaches out there with their passion.
We
Yeah,
want harmonious passion, not obsessive passion.
that's right. But we've got information for that also that you can get through the website.
Okay, fantastic. And just to let everybody know, Yeager is spelled Yeager.
That's correct. Thanks.
Jon, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. I've loved reading your book over last week. I'm going to be diving more into it. I'll have to order one of those workbooks. So I'm looking forward to doing that. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dan. I really appreciate it.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast. And I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Site Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.